Helgoland is the only territory that Britain ever lost to Germany. It's a tiny island with no cars that's still home to about 1,000 Germans today, but most people don't know that it exists, let alone remembering the weird deal that saw Germany win it from Britain, or what the Nazis used it for that made the British return after the war to drop the biggest bomb since Nagasaki on this innocent-looking island in the North Sea, and even fewer people have had the chance to visit for themselves. Helgoland is truly tiny, barely covering a single square kilometre, which means that you have roughly the same amount of land as Heathrow Airport, if you put 12 Helgolands next to each other. But maps like this can't explain to you just how remote this forgotten former outpost of the British Empire really is. There is nothing to see for the first couple of hours of the boat ride until these red cliffs finally appear, and you feel that you're about to discover one of the Earth's last untouched wildernesses. Okay, so the nice hiking trail and safety barriers probably aren't original features, but if you look out at the red sandstone and the sea, you could almost be seeing the same view that greeted the first settlers here over 1,000 years ago. Like many places in Northern Europe, Helgoland's first residents were ethnic Frisians. They had their own language and their own way of life, to the extent that when the Danish Navy arrived in the 1400s and said, "You're Danish people now," nothing really changed. In those days, Denmark controlled all of this land anyway, and Helgoland remained a remote and peaceful place where fishermen and the odd smuggler could live, mind their own business, and avoid fancy mainland inventions like the law and the taxman. But of course, if you're a tasty-looking and vulnerable little island, the one thing that you can't avoid for too long is the British Empire, and their arrival in the 1800s would set off a chain reaction that made this sleepy island into the host of some of Europe's most dramatic storylines. So why did Britain feel the need to steal this little postage stamp from Denmark? Well, sadly for the first British soldiers to get sent here, they weren't signed up to a wildlife photography retreat. They were dealing with something much more frivolous. Napoleon. France's tetchy tyrant took his tragic defeat at Trafalgar pretty terribly. He already hated the Brits, but now the humiliating revelation that he could never best them at sea was giving him sleepless nights. His domination over Europe would never be complete with the second superpower at his doorstep though, so he turned to an economic war instead, leveraging France's vast sphere of influence to ban all mainland European ports from trading with British ships. It was a blockade that he thought would starve out Britain's economy, weakening them to the point that an invasion would be easy. But even in what seemed like a simple game of cat and mouse, Napoleon was about to get outfoxed. Within a year, Britain had identified Copenhagen as the weak link in his chain of client states and launched a vicious attack on their main harbours. And on the way home, the Brits looked at the Danish-owned island of Helgoland and said, "Oh, and by the way, I'm having this too. Yeah, what are you going to do? I just burned and stole half your navy, so finders keepers." This serene little rock that I'm currently walking around 200 years later may seem too small to be important, but Britain taking this outpost so close to the European mainland was the cheat code to turning Napoleon's blockade into a major own goal. Europe was obviously experiencing a severe shortage of goods from Britain and its empire that had seen prices go through the roof, which gave plenty of incentive to smugglers. And now that they owned Helgoland, which was so near to all these Hanseatic trading cities, Britain had a pretty convincing elevator pitch to any entrepreneurs with access to a boat. If you want to make a fortune flipping cotton and sugar into mainland Europe, come and buy it from us here. You carry only the risk of taking it this far past the French Navy, who presumably can't arrest you all at once. And oh yeah, we're not going to tax you. This is an official duty-free island. Come and trade as much as you want. After that, Helgoland's harbour could hardly sustain the 24/7 traffic jams. Britain was getting loaded again, Europeans were drinking Jamaican rum again, and Napoleon had egg on his face. Again. And so British Helgoland, which to them was actually Heligoland, although nobody knows where they found that extra I or even where the original Frisian name Helgoland came from anyway, spent most of the 1800s becoming an early tourist destination. And I can totally see why, as demonstrated by me enjoying the fresh air here, stood right at the end of the earth, an experience which is, frankly, unbelievable. But back then, this little island that flew a flag with the Union Jack on it and printed stamps with Queen Victoria's face on them was beloved by elites from both sides of the channel for another reason. Yes, they loved the moderate climate and the cheap cigars, but a trip to Helgoland was also an opportunity to engage in recreational debauchery away from the watchful eyes of polite mainland society. It was a duty-free haven of new hotels, bars, casinos and spas that was developing something of a reputation as a home for lost playboys and gamblers. But there was one very distinguished visitor who's actually immortalised in this statue down at the seafront today for doing one of the most classy and ironic things ever done on this island. August Heinrich Hoffmann von Fallersleben was a German poet who, during a visit to Helgoland in 1841, wrote the lyrics for what would go on to be called Das Lied der Deutschen, the Song of the Germans, which means that part of the German national anthem was actually written in the British Empire. Since we have Nazis and this insane bomb to get to, I'm going to hold myself back and only repeat that sentence once. The German national anthem was written on British soil. Okay, feel free to subscribe if you want me to stop going on about that. Funnily enough, by the 1800s, Helgoland was actually garnering more and more attention over in Germany. Bismarck and the First Kaiser had finally unified Germandom, including conquering all of this land, which left Helgoland as really the only thing in the area that they didn't control, and they were increasingly anxious about it becoming a foothold from which they could be attacked. Tensions and competition with Britain were increasing both in Europe and on the colonial frontier, and this island meant that rival ships sat in the way of all routes in and out of Hamburg, which is kind of like if you let Germany colonise the Isle of Man and just assume that they'll let you keep accessing Liverpool. The very new and very expensive Kiel Canal now meant that this was the route to and from the Baltic Sea as well. Germany had to do something about this weird little tea-drinking thorn in their side. So they made an offer to Britain. Give us Helgoland and we'll stop competing with you in East Africa. We'll back away from most of our claims there and recognise your sole control over the island of Zanzibar and a huge chunk of the mainland, mostly in what is now Tanzania and Uganda. At first, some British commentators were shocked. Cede Helgoland to the Germans? Britannia never loses a limb of her empire, however small. And it's not even falling in battle or to an independence revolt, we're just voluntarily trading it away? No way, the sun shall never set on our little toothpick in the sea. Queen Victoria herself was actually sceptical, but she was also aware that Germany's new Kaiser was her grandson, and familial ties made her willing to do anything to foster peaceful relations between the two countries. Meanwhile, others in London kind of liked the sound of the deal and saw it as expanding the empire. Zanzibar alone is 139 Heathrows in size. Compared to losing Helgoland, a meagre 0.08 Heathrows, it was a no-brainer. And primacy over certain parts of the African mainland in the absence of German troops? That would make life easier too. If it came to war between the two nations, Helgoland was so isolated that it would be the first thing to fall anyway. Might as well trade something for it now, while we can. So British and German diplomats hashed out the deal, and the Helgoland-Zanzibar Treaty was signed on the 1st of July 1890. The day that this island became the only land that Britain ever lost to Germany. A fact enshrined nowhere more clearly than by the German spelling of fish und chips on this little hut down by the sea when I visited. This small town raised the German flag, the tax-free status was preserved, and the roughly 3,000 residents at that time became German citizens. But again, local life was fairly unaffected. Casino staff maybe changed what language they spoke, but trading ships were still stopping here all the time, just waving this guy's flag instead of this guy's. The working class, Frisian-speaking locals who didn't pay taxes to either of them anyway, might be forgiven for not caring. One thing you absolutely would care about, however, is when this guy and this guy can't stop going to war with each other. These waters were actually the scene of the first naval battle of World War I, in which Germany suffered significant losses. But by the end of the war, they had still made persistent efforts to use Helgoland as a naval base, as you can see from all the infrastructure that they'd built here. And the Allies found this concerning enough that Helgoland was actually explicitly mentioned in the Treaty of Versailles, which legally obligated the defeated Germany to destroy all fortifications on Helgoland and never rebuild them. Oh boy, I really hope this story isn't about to feature a German leader who disregards his legal obligations. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, calling it a shameless document signed by traitors that he would tear to pieces. And during the 1930s, his regime quietly drew up some pretty wild plans for illegally refortifying this island. And yeah, I know that in terms of Nazi war crimes, this is like a parking ticket, but I don't know, I guess I wanted to point out the fact that this was all illegal. They actually wanted to expand Helgoland to 10 times its natural size, essentially creating an artificial archipelago out of millions of tons of concrete. In their fantasies, Helgoland would become the super Gibraltar of the North Sea, overflowing with anti-air guns and bunkers and U-boat pens and new harbours. They were building the perfect floating fortress from which to invade Britain. And this focus on Helgoland even shows in propaganda artworks like this painting, which symbolises the German Empire spreading its wings in the North Sea. The original of which was actually personally purchased by Hitler from an art show in Munich. He went on to visit the real island before the war to check on construction work and kiss babies and that sort of thing. And then, weirdly, the first aerial battle of World War II actually took place over Helgoland airspace as well. But after Germany lost the Battle of Britain and opened up a new Eastern Front against Russia, resources were spread too thin, and invading the British mainland was seen as way too much of a pipe dream to continue building here. And Helgoland went on to play a more defensive role as a radar site before being hit by a 1,000-bomber raid in April 1945. But it was the period after the war that leaves the biggest scars on the island today. Even with that ultra fortification plan left unfinished, the occupying allies were left with a big seaborne conundrum. They found that a lot of new sea walls, tunnels and bunkers had already been built here. If all that fell into the wrong hands, it could genuinely be used to attack Britain someday. And diplomacy of the pen had already failed after the last war, so what could they do? This time they reached for the sword, deciding to try to wipe Helgoland off the face of the earth. In 1947, the Royal Navy evacuated civilians from the island and brought over all the surplus ordnance they could get their hands on. They filled the harbours and the tunnels with over 100,000 depth charges, torpedo heads and explosive shells. When they detonated all that, with the German press watching on, it caused what some describe as the biggest non-nuclear explosion of all time, in a blast that was estimated to be about half the strength of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Seismic tremors were registered across Western Europe. Towns on the German mainland were instructed to keep their doors and windows open to let the shockwave pass through, and poor old Helgoland was flattened. It's kind of sad that at a time when the post-war occupation was rebuilding the rest of Germany in places like Cologne, this one-of-a-kind beautiful island that I'm stood on right now was still taking fresh hits. But maybe the most intriguing part is this newsreel footage. I mean, we have the archetype from movies and cartoons of the man pressing the big red button, but how often do you actually get to see it? It's because Operation Big Bang, classic British understatement by the way, was actually orchestrated as a propaganda event to impress into the German psyche the idea that even an exhausted, war-torn Britain can always come back and hit you hard whenever it likes. It was time to coincide with what would have been Hitler's birthday, and film reels like this one, titled, again, euphemistically, Heligoland Goes Up, were a hit back home. When you see this footage of the blast, perhaps you find it unsurprising to learn that Helgoland's topography was completely ruined. If you've spent this video thinking it looks like I'm walking around one huge bomb site, that's because I am. You can see from these old postcards that it always had 2 tiers, but these days it has like 4, 5, 6, coupled with the fact that RAF bombers used Helgoland as target practice for the next 5 years, you end up with this bizarre and unnatural landscape. One moment you feel like you're walking around another peaceful Nordic coastal town, and the next, like you're dodging craters on the surface of the moon. You can still see the last surviving crumbs of Nazi infrastructure like piers and train tracks today, but as you can see by the eerie lack of buildings in this aftershot, the explosion had pretty much done its job. It was so devastating that when the RAF finally gave in to protests and left, and Helgoland could be peacefully resettled, there was yet another dilemma. About 3,000 West German citizens wanted to move back here overnight, but yeah, no houses to move back into. So again, when I show you these streets from the small town that exists in the upper part of the island today, if you think it looks like I'm walking around an open-air museum of standardized 1950s German housing, That's because I am. Helgoland was rebuilt from a blank slate all at once as quickly as possible, and since then there's obviously been nowhere to build anything new. The island is kind of frozen in time, which is one of the most charming things about it. It's truly a one-of-a-kind place to visit, partly because at times you feel more likely to bump into a seal than another human, and partly because the serene seaside setting is made all the more peaceful by the complete absence of cars. My entire weekend there, I didn't hear a single engine. It's actually enshrined in German law that Helgoland is to see neither motor vehicle nor bicycle, and the place is all the more peaceful for it. There's a couple of these electric vehicles down at the harbour to meet the boats when they come in, and apparently there is a mini electric ambulance and police car for emergencies, but that's it. And it's so inspiring to see all the hard work that's gone into rebuilding a peaceful civilian life here. A small handful of hotels, cafes and convenience stores now sit on the bottom half, but there's no room for anything more than that, or, obviously, since it's only 0.08 Heathrows wide, for an airport. The closest thing is this small landing strip on Helgoland's sandy little sister over here, from which you can be ferried across to the main island. Helgoland has one primary school which still teaches children Helgolandic, a unique blend of Old Frisian with plenty of English loanwords, as well as a chess club for young and old meeting every Sunday at 5, and a hall where you can watch the latest blockbusters. But to outsiders, this island is known more for these beautiful cliffs, the study of bird life, and the fact that it has no pollen-producing plants. Weirdly, that natural coincidence actually led to the invention of quantum physics, as German scientist Werner Heisenberg spent summers here to escape his hay fever symptoms, which gave him the time to write the paper that would kickstart that new field in this very town. But whatever topic is on your mind, even if it's not that complicated, coming here to daydream and stand in the footsteps of the ghosts of North Sea past is an experience that I can absolutely recommend. When you can't see anything off in the distance anyway, you feel like you might as well be lost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean somewhere, even if you're just a few hours from Hamburg. Helgoland is a remarkable and defiant place that's proudly refused to fall, succumbing neither to human meddling nor the forces of Mother Nature herself. But probably its most famous attribute is still its duty-free status, and Germans happily make the journey over by boat to buy discounted products to this day. Where else in the world can you raise a glass knowing that the reason your drink is so cheap was originally an attempt to stick it to Napoleon? Cheers to that, subscribe for more stories from around the world, and I'll see you next time.